Okay, we're recording. Did you guys get a
Thank you,
notification?
Josh. Okay, welcome to the Utah Jewish Genealogical Society October meeting. Our guest tonight is Elizabeth Foote. She's going to talk about her ancestral town and the adventures she had there this summer, as well as how she ended up there in the first place. So I give the time to Elizabeth.
Thank you. So I attended Family Discovery Day at Roots Tech this year with a friend, and we're wandering around, and she pointed out the Jewish Genealogical Society booth to me, then quickly realized she was going to just need to leave me there because I was going to be a while. I was hoping to discover new places on the web where I could extend my research, but after about 20 minutes, it became apparent that I'd exhausted them already. And as I was walking away, I stopped to look at some of the literature, and a nice woman asked me where I lived. And when I told her Utah, she asked if I belonged to the Jewish Genealogical Society. I said no. She said, "Oh, the president of the local chapter is right there." So she took me by the arm and led me over to Kathy and introduced us. And before I knew it, my mouth was running away with me, and I was telling her about my upcoming trip to Germany. She pulled out her phone and said, "What are you doing in September? Would you like to present, or excuse me, October? What would you like to present at our monthly meeting? Tell us about your trip." I opened my mouth to say no, thank you, but what came out was an enthusiastic yes. And in order for the details of my trip to make sense, I need to share the backstory of how one small village unlocked a host of discoveries and ended 40 years of wandering in the genealogical wilderness. It all started with my mom, Jeanette. She was intrepid. After being widowed at 39, she raised 3 children on her own and moved us across country because she heard Utah was a good place to live and raise kids. She was an avid gardener. She was a gifted artist, and in the time before personal computers and CGI, was one of a handful of medical illustrators in the country. She loved, excuse me, she loved learning and took countless classes at BYU, focusing primarily on German and genealogy. In 1977, she started researching her paternal line, determined to find out all she could about where her great-grandfather Adolf Roth was from. She spent 3 years hitting one brick wall after another until she found a ship's manifest for the SS Bremen. This ship arrived in New York City on 3 July 1866, and in the manifest, she found Adolf, his wife Katinka, and their 3 children, Wilhelmina, Augusta, and Reinhard. Mom knew the names. She knew the ages. Everything matched except for the last name. She was looking for Roth, and this was Rothschild or Rothschild. I was sitting with her at the kitchen table when she called her father and said, "I found what I think is your grandfather, his wife, and their children, but the last name is Rothschild. Do you think it's the same people?" "Oh, yes," he said. "The family name was changed, or that was the family name, but my father changed it to Roth. Why didn't you tell me? You knew I was trying to research this family line." "Oh, I didn't think it was important," he said, "and you never asked." He was a great one for not sharing information. After a while, Mom shifted her focus from the elusive Roth and Rothschild family to her maternal line. Can't blame her, it was much easier to follow. And around 2002, after I'd become interested in genealogy, Mom handed the reins over to me. All of her research fit in one folder, about half an inch thick. As far as research logs are concerned, Mom was a much better genealogist than I am, but I had something she didn't, the internet. Mom was brilliant at so many things, but modern technology wasn't one of them. When she needed a new laptop, her main priority was making sure it had free cell so she could play that. Where Mom had written letters, I could send emails and get a response in days. Where she had spent countless hours poring over old records, I could create a search parameter and have results in moments. Where she spent weeks traipsing all over the countryside, having grand adventures and discovering things firsthand, I sat at home doing research in my bunny slippers. But the fact remained, I was able to make progress on our tree and build on the incredibly solid foundation she had created. What we knew about this family was sparse. Adolf and his wife Katinka arrived in New York on 3 July 1866, entering the United States through Castle Garden, now known as Castle Clinton, and with them were 5-year-old Wilhelmina, 4-year-old Augusta, and 18-month-old Reinhardt. They were from the village of Foote in Hesse. They settled in Illinois for a few years, where their youngest son, my great-grandfather, Edward Otto Rothschild, was born. And between 1880 and 1890, the family moved to St. Louis, where they stayed. When Edward was about 19, he and his father had a fight about professions. Adolf wanted his son to be a Lutheran minister, which really confused us. For his part, Edward wanted to be an artist. The argument became quite heated, and in the morning, Edward left without a word, and no one heard from him for 9 years. By the time he returned, he'd spent 3 years in the army, fought in the Spanish-American War, and had changed his name to Roth. He had also begun his career as an artist. Shortly after returning from his self-imposed exile, Edward, or E.O. as our family has come to call him, painted these portraits of his parents. Photographs of them let us know they are extremely accurate. In 1904, he married Teresa Maria Prof, whose family were also German immigrants, albeit Catholic. They welcomed daughter Edna Catherine and son Carol William before moving the family to Los Angeles, where youngest daughter Eugenia Josephine was born. Carol William, or Bill Roth, was my grandfather, the one who didn't know why Mom needed to know more about name changes. Despite their 10-year age difference, E.O. and his sister Augusta were quite close, and she made periodic trips across country to visit her baby brother and his family. She is seen here in the back right. She would have told her nieces and nephew about her own children. She had 7. And we know that Edna, in the blue dress, corresponded with some of her cousins, primarily Winifred, but we don't think they ever met. By the time Mom started her research, our family tree had shrunk to an incredibly small size. We had our first family reunion in 1980 at Mom's cousin Betty's house in Santa Ana, California. 3 people could not attend the reunion, which means there were 17 of us that could. And while parts of it were fun, when it was finished, all agreed that there would be no more family reunions until my grandparents' generation had all died off. The drama was just too much. My grandmother and her sister-in-law, Jean, could not stand each other, and there was actually an incident from my mother's childhood where Mom had found the cat licking the icing off the cake. My grandmother cut a slice of cake, took it out, presented it to Jean, and said, "Would you like some cake?" So we waited until they had all passed on to do that again. By 1984, Mom had turned her attention to her mother's line with much greater success. She still periodically poked around at the elusive Rothschilds, but the truth was, while she knew a lot about her grandparents, Edward and Teresa, their children, and their grandchildren, she knew next to nothing about her grandfather's siblings and their families and wasn't making any progress. I became interested in genealogy around 95 or so and started on my father's side, which is incredibly twisted and intertwined and takes inbred to a whole new level. In fact, when I ran a relationship calculation between me and my father, it came back with 13 different connections and said my brothers were my 3rd cousins. As fascinating as that tangled line was, most of the research had already been done, and after a while I lost interest. So around 2002, I started taking my own jabs at the Rothschilds, and it wasn't long before I found a fascinating website, synagoga-fo.de. The website was rough and seemed to have 2 parts, the original in German, which was much more detailed, and the other half, which was in English. The 2 didn't necessarily share a lot of information. My German at the time was minimal at best. I had studied in high school in the 80s, but that had been a very long time ago, and I hadn't done any practicing since. What I did find, though, was a comprehensive list of all the Jews who had lived in the village going back to the late 1600s, grouped alphabetically by last name. All of the information had been culled from civic records. There were a lot of people named Rothschild. None of them, however, were named Adolf, and none of them had Adolf's birth date of 28 December 1829. There was an Abraham Rothschild, born 29 December 1829, to Asher Rothschild and his wife Sprinza Sternberg, but it seemed unlikely that they were related. Still, I made periodic visits back to the website, searching for clues, and I started emailing with the people responsible for the website. First, Kurt Willi Julius, and then after his passing, Karl-Heinz Stettler. They were always very courteous in their replies, but I'm sure they grew tired of me asking the same questions. I was poking around the Synagogue Full website one day when I stumbled across a section about a man named Richard Rothschild. He was born in Foote, recognized the Nazi Party for what it was even before Kristallnacht, and was a guest of the SS, spending 2 weeks in jail after he scaled a cliff to tear down a Nazi flag in the middle of the night. After that experience, he knew he needed to emigrate, preferably to Palestine. Visas were more likely to be given to married couples than single adults. He met a young woman named Gerda who was running into a similar problem. The two were soon married, solely for the sake of self-preservation. Eventually, though, they grew to love each other intensely and remained together until Gerda's passing the end of December 2005. Richard followed her just 24 days later, a few months before his 101st birthday. What struck me most about Richard wasn't his history, but his artwork and his face. There are artists all over the place in my family tree, and the people in my family look alike. And I don't just mean the siblings. The man in the middle is my uncle, Billy. The woman to his right is my mother, Jeanette. The woman to his left is their first cousin. She and my mother look like siblings. My second cousin, Heather, and I look like we could be sisters. And my third cousin, Becky, and I definitely look like cousins. And then there's my great-grandfather, E.O. Roth, and Richard Rothschild. I really honestly saw a resemblance, but I didn't trust myself. So I showed the pictures to my roommate and said, "What do you think?" And she said, "Same guy, just older." So it wasn't just me. I was driving home from work one night in 2005 when I got a phone call from a woman named Becky Russo. She asked if I was related to E.O. Roth, the artist, and told me she was descended from his sister, Augusta Rothschild. My excitement level was over the moon. For the first time in my life, I was talking to a cousin I didn't know. I was so hopeful that she had more information about the Rothschild family that she could share with me, and she did, but only about Augusta's branch of the family, nothing beyond Adolf and Katinka. What was fascinating to me, though, is that we shared the same pieces of family lore. Adolf and Katinka met in a bar when he was 24 and she was 14, working as a barmaid, and she served him a beer. They courted for 10 years before her parents consented to their marriage, and her family had once been courtiers in the royal courts of Spain and had escaped during the diaspora in the 1500s, settling in Germany. About a year after that first conversation, Becky and her husband Tony came to Salt Lake for a visit, and I met up with them for dinner one evening and invited my mom and stepdad to join us, which they did. When I first met Becky, I was disappointed and thought, she doesn't have the look. But as soon as I saw her with Mom, I realized she most definitely did. My third cousin's face seems to be the bridge between mine and my mom's. She and my mom and I had a lovely evening poring over pedigree charts and comparing notes. Not sure what Dad and Tony talked about. In 2003, the E.O. Roth clan had a family reunion. Armed with butcher paper, rulers, markers, and pictures and information printed on peel and stick paper, Mom and I put together a 12-foot-long pedigree chart showing the family of Adolf and Katinka Rothschild. There was plenty of space left over. Their youngest son's line was the most complete because that's who we knew. Edward's daughter, Edna, had one child, Betty. His daughter, Eugenia, Jean, had one child, Sandra. and his son Billy got crazy and had two children, my mom Jeanette and my uncle Bill. Billy never married and has no children. My mom has three, myself and two brothers. Sandra has one son, and Betty has six. This created a unique phenomenon in that there are no first cousins on my generational plane. Sandra's son and Betty's six are my only maternal cousins. Betty married an only child, so we are their only cousins. We're a fairly tight-knit group, even when we go a few years without seeing each other. Over the next several years, I began finding information about Adolf and Katinka's other children and their families. I touched base with a cousin from Reinhardt's family and several from Augusta's, still searching for living descendants for Wilhelmina. The main thing, though, was progress was being made, even if it was laterally. I made sure to put all of my information on Ancestry.com, and I always included my contact information. Every step of the way had been arduous, and I wanted anyone else researching this tree to have it easier than I did. In February of 2015, I received an email from Camille Kalman in New York City, wanting to know if we were related. She had started her genealogical journey the day before, had stumbled across my tree on Ancestry and recognized some of the names. Just like in my family, her grandfather didn't see the need to share any useful information, and just like in mine, she thought the family name was Roth. Camille dove into the deep end of the genealogy pool, and it wasn't long before we had gone from strangers to cousins to research partners to good, very close friends. She's an attorney, and her attention to detail matched mine. Neither one of us just accepts those leaves as fact until we've researched them to the nth degree. She was, quite literally, a huge blessing and an answer to prayer. We kept making that lateral progress and kept going back to the Synagogue Phil website, hoping to find something new. In the summer of 2016, Camille received a hint on Ancestry, but with no documents attached. It said Adolf Rothschild, son of Abraham and Iris, was on 1 June 1860 baptized in the parish church of Burgmünden, which I discovered was about halfway between Adolf's home in Foote and Katinka's home in Hanau. Assuming this was correct, it raised a lot of questions. How did they meet? Why did a nice Jewish boy convert? What did her family think of this? Have you ever had one of those light bulb moments when you really see something for the first time and the pieces start falling into place? Well, about the time Camille got that hint, I took a good hard look at Katinka, and I realized there was absolutely zero chance her family was Jewish. And I don't know why I hadn't picked up on it before. In fact, no one in the family had noticed it. Probably the result of Christian upbringing. But there's no way a nice Jewish girl was born to Christoph Luja and Christiana Heil. So now we know why Adolf converted. Extrapolating from that, we decided he converted, married a Lutheran, and was disowned. But before we could really answer those questions, we needed a copy of that baptismal record. So we wrote to the church in Burgmünden. We heard back very shortly from a nice person who informed us we'd actually reached the church of Niedergemünden and suggested we reach out to Burgmünden, and here is their email address. So we wrote them, and we waited and waited and waited. That was in July of 2016. One January day in 2017, I was going through Mom's research notes and found an article about Jewish genealogical research written back in the 80s. The very last paragraph caught my attention. Paraphrased, it said, ironically, the largest repository of Jewish genealogical records is with the Mormons at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. I just stared and got goosebumps and probably thumped my forehead with my hand. It had never once occurred to me to go to the library to see if I could find anything. I know it was a Monday because the library was going to close early. As soon as I was done with work around 3, I kissed my husband, told him I'd be back later, and drove downtown. I explained to the nice man at the desk that I was looking for baptismal records from Burgmünden from 1860. He pulled the microfilm, got me all set up at a reader, and turned me loose. And about 5 seconds later, I knew I was in trouble. I was no longer fluent in German, and I absolutely could not read the old script, but I could read numbers. So I figured I'd get to the right date, then ask for help. I was getting close to the right date and gave the wheel one more crank, and the screen froze with the document perfectly centered, and I could read the name in the margin, Adolf Rothschild. I asked the nice man at the desk if he could read Alta Schrift, and he said he could. He came over, skimmed through the document without saying a word, and then exclaimed, "He was Jewish?" I started to sob. I still didn't know what the document said, but I knew this was my guy. And I'm impressed that he could read that chicken scratch. But basically it says, on 1 June 1860, after months of study, going before the board and demonstrating his understanding of Christianity and his acceptance of the Lutheran faith, the Jew Abraham Rothschild, born 29 December 1829, to the deceased merchant Asher Rothschild of Foote and his first wife Sprinza née Sternberg, was baptized and given by the priest the Christian name of Adolf. I knew about Asher and Sprinza from the Synagogue Full website, and I knew they had a son named Abraham. And now I knew that their Abraham and my Adolf were the same person. And in the space of a moment, my great-great-grandfather went from being an orphan with no family to being one of 12 children with parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and cousins galore. And that my great-grandfather Edward and Richard Rothschild were first cousins once removed. My family tree, with about 125 people on it, quickly exploded to 9 generations of Rothschilds and their relatives, starting with Adolf's grandfather, Solomon Abraham Rothschild, born in about 1759. Mom began her research into this family in 1977, trying to find the connection to Foote, and in 2017, I found it. The significance of that 40 years wasn't lost on me. I came from the library that night, so excited, and I called Camille, voicemail. I called Mom's cousin Betty, no answer. I called my cousin Heather, same. There was one person I knew would be home that I really wanted to tell, and that was Mom. But Mom had had a stroke several years earlier and barely knew who I was. Genealogy wasn't even on her radar. Eventually, I was able to get hold of Betty and Heather and Camille, and their excitement matched mine. Camille and I spent the next several months poring over the Synagogue Full website, gathering up all the information and fitting it into our family tree, figuring out our family lore. We believe Adolf worked for the family business and his father was a merchant, and took a business trip to Hanau where he met Katinka. We later learned her mother owned a tobacconist shop, and since we know Adolf was fond of cigars, he once patented a self-lighting match dispenser. This is more likely where they met. Adolf's father died in January of 1859. The new theory was Adolf mourned for a year like a good Jewish son, then took Lutheran lessons so he could marry the alluring Katinka. Camille and I decided to host a family reunion in October of 2017. Initially, we were going to have about 15 people, which is pretty good for our reunions, but by the time it came down to it, there were only 8 of us, which turned out to be the perfect combination. Camille and I put together a PowerPoint presentation detailing our journey and walking the family through our progress. When we were done, the only person not looking completely shell-shocked was my 8-year-old niece. She asked a lot of questions, including where she was on the new and improved pedigree chart. Remember the old one? It was 12 feet long and had pictures? The new one was over 30 feet long, no room for pictures, just address labels with names and dates. As soon as I confirmed our relationship with the Rothschilds of Foote, I began emailing with the chairman of the board of the Foote, Karl-Heinz Stettler. The Foote is basically friends of the synagogue, is what it means. and I let him know of our discoveries, and I spent more time on the Synagogue Full website. I don't know what that means. Okay, we'll just keep going. I spent more time on the Synagogue Full website, eventually learning just what the Foote was and how it came about. I made it go away. Okay. To best explain who they were, we need to discuss the history of the synagogue itself. The village of Foote is located in Hesse near Castle Waldeck. It has a population currently of about 900 and is the county seat for the district, which totals about 5,000 people in 15 different villages. In the early 1800s, the Jewish community of the area was growing, and everyone got along with everyone else. Jews and Gentiles living and working side by side, joining and forming clubs together and choirs and athletic organizations. Religion didn't matter. School apparently did. In the late 1820s, Asher Rothschild financed the building of a Jewish school in Foote that would serve the entire community. The plan was that the head of each family would pay dues to Asher until the construction costs were offset. The school was completed in 1827 with room for the school teacher and his family to live there as well. In 1829, it was dedicated as a synagogue, complete with a women's balcony, not to mention a cupola ceiling painted robin's egg blue and dotted with gold stars. In August of 1938, Asher's grandson, Alfred Asher Rothschild, acting on behalf of the Jewish community, removed the Star of David rose window and sold the building to a newly arrived Gentile family, thereby saving it from destruction by the Nazis. For the next 40 years, it remained a residence. In 1999, though, it went up for sale, and a handful of civic-minded villagers made a proposal that went up for a vote. The village would buy it, restore it, and use it as an information center. The people of the village voted against it. The mayor approached this group and let them know there was some funding available for a club that wanted to take on the project. The asking price of the building was 40,000 Deutschmark. The city could contribute 35,000. It was a no-brainer. The Friends of the Synagogue Club was formed, the building was purchased, and in November of 1999, they had their first meeting. The building was in a terrible state of repair, would need to be completely renovated, electricity and water added, and on that bitter cold November day, as they sat shivering in the sanctuary, it was 100% agreed upon that radiant floor heating should be installed in the floors and up the walls. The next several years were spent fundraising and renovating. Everything that could be saved absolutely was, including the incredible ceiling. And the Star of David rose window was replaced. A piece of the original rood screen for the women's balcony was found. And one day, someone showed up with a grocery bag containing a menorah. They indicated it had been given to them by someone who wished to remain anonymous, who told them someone in their family had taken it from the synagogue during the war, and this person felt it should be returned. The cost of the renovations topped out at over 400,000 euro. They took this thing down to the studs. Funds for it were raised through concerts, movie nights, lectures, art exhibits, all with the theme of never forget. Never forget the contributions the Jews of the area added to the rich tapestry of daily life and the holes left in that tapestry that can never be repaired. The absolute miracle of this project is that there are no Jews left in the district. This was conceived, implemented, and executed by Christians. In addition to the renovations, they have traveled all over Germany and as far as Jerusalem to find civic records regarding the Jews of Foote and have transcribed every one of them, posting the information on their website. Hundreds of names, thousands of documents, a veritable treasure trove of information. And that's what it looks like today. Camille and I, with some help from her brother Andy, kept chugging along, making new discoveries, all of which we passed along to Karl Heinz. In March of 2019, I received an unexpected email from him. The Förderkreis was going to have their 20th anniversary celebration in May, and they were inviting all descendants of Vöhler Jews to come. My husband and I do all right financially, but last-minute trips to Europe aren't really in the budget. I responded, said I'd look into it, but I didn't think it was likely. That night, a friend of mine, Shell, came over to visit, and I told her about the invitation. Shell is a very spiritual person, not religious, but spiritual, and she's on planes I don't even know about. But we were in my office where I have photographs of various ancestors, and she got this glassy look on her face, tilted her head to one side as she stared at the portrait of one of my Catholic ancestors, and then she said, "Okay, I'll tell her." Tell me what? "Your ancestors want you to go. They say it's really important and they'll make it happen." A month later, I got an email from Karl Heinz. He needed to know if I was coming. Not only that, he wanted me to know that all I had to do was get there, and all other expenses, food, lodging, and transportation would be taken care of by the Förderkreis. I checked airfare. It had dropped from over $1,800 to less than $1,000. Better, but still outside the budget until our tax return came. Moments later, I got a text from Shell. "What's airfare today?" I told her. The next text was a picture of her credit card. "Get it. Pay me back when your tax return comes in." With tears in my eyes, I bought the plane ticket. In the end, Shell only let me pay back about 3/4 of the cost of the ticket, asking only that I bring her back lots of pictures, which I did. I emailed Karl Heinz and asked if Camille could join me. His resounding yes was immediate. And so, on 15 May 2019, I landed in Frankfurt. Karl Heinz picked me up from the airport and drove me to Foote, stopping at the synagogue. Camille followed a day later. What followed was a whirlwind of amazing experience. There are two other descendants there, Jeff and Daniel Baird, whose great-grandparents lived next door to the Rothschilds. Camille and I were thrilled to meet our neighbors. Camille arrived Thursday in time for dinner. On Friday, the Rothschild girls and the Frankenthal boys were taken sightseeing, ending up at the synagogue. I had been there the evening of my first day, but this was Camille's first time. The look on her face was priceless. As we stood there, taking it all in, Karl Heinz brushed past us, marched to the front of the sanctuary, all the way over to the right. With a huge grin on his face, he said, "Hier ist Platz Nummer 1. Here is place number 1. We had no idea what he was talking about. "When Richard Rothschild came here in 1999, he said, he stood in this spot, proclaimed it Platz Nummer 1, and said, this is the hereditary seating place for the Rothschild family, earned by Asher Rothschild. Asher the merchant and financier, our third great-grandfather. A few minutes later, we were in the women's balcony. I happened to glance up and see the number 14 painted on the header. I showed it to Camille, and the two of us raced around the balcony until we found Platz Nummer 1, the place Asher's wife Sprinza sat, and following her death, his second wife Blümchen, and all of their children, including Adolf. It held extra special meaning for Camille because she descends from both Sprinza and Blümchen. Huge thanks to Daniel Baird for taking this picture of us. My husband's hometown is Ephraim, and every time we went to visit his parents, his whole demeanor would change as soon as we got into Sanpete County. More relaxed, more at peace, more centered with his soul, and I have always envied them of that. I moved 3 times before I started 2nd grade, 2 more before I started 7th, and 17 times with my first husband. In May of 2019, I finally found that inner peace, that feeling of being in my hometown. Too bad it's 5,000 miles away. The Jewish cemetery in Foote, especially, is a place of peace for me. During World War II, the Nazis ordered all the headstones in the Jewish cemetery be removed and stored at a local barn, with instructions to the villagers to use them for building materials. After the war, the Allies instructed the villagers to put them back. The cemetery had served the extended Jewish community for well over 100 years. Only 46 headstones returned. Of those, only one belonged to a direct antecedent, Sprinza Sternberg Rothschild. It is a large piece of granite, over 3 feet tall, about 18 inches wide, and about 12 inches thick, all inscribed in Hebrew. Her death date uses the Hebrew calendar, and for a long time it was buried because it was at the bottom of the headstone, and you can see the color changes at the bottom of the headstone. But eventually it was raised and reset, and I was able to determine she died 6 September 1833, when her youngest child, Moritz Moses, was just 8 days old. Camille and I were tickled to visit her grave. We had forgotten to take pebbles with us, so we made do with wildflowers across the road. Another highlight of the trip was to visit the Rothschild house. In 1836, the same year he married his second wife, Blümchen, Ascher's house burned down, so he built a new house nearby. He apparently wanted to make sure there was plenty of room for everyone and everything. The ground floor was the Jewish school for a while until it became a bakery. There was a mikveh with a mosaic tile and warm water in the basement. Once the bakery moved in, the Jewish school moved up a level. The school teacher and his family moved into the level above that. The Rothschilds lived in the level above that. Sparing no expense, there were 2 attics. The first one had all the modern conveniences, built-in drying racks so you didn't have to take your clothes outside. And the top attic has 12-foot ceiling space and was just for storage. The registry marks on the beams and timbers are identical to those used on the synagogue, so I imagine Ascher used the same company to build his house. The 3 floors of living space, not counting the bakery and the 2 attics, total about 8,500 square feet. It is massive. A number of years ago, the house went up for sale, and a couple from Holland bought it for less than 50,000 euros, with the idea of turning it into a multi-use space, apartments, Airbnb. They want to put a Rothschild museum where the bakery used to be. We're all in favor of that. The first thing they did was replace all the windows with the standard European high-efficiency windows that are so ugly. The local historical society let them know the windows needed to fit the era of the home, so they replaced all 64 of them to the tune of $100,000. The renovations are still ongoing, but we have hope that the owners will reach a turning point soon, and I've been invited to stay there when I go back again in 5 years. The highlight of that trip was actually the first evening of the 3-day celebration. We gathered in the synagogue, which seats about 200 or so, for the opening ceremonies. But before that was a Shabbat service. As I've previously mentioned, there are no Jews left in the area. So a congregation from Marburg, about an hour away, made the journey to celebrate Shabbat in full. Before the service started, Karl-Heinz welcomed everyone, detailed the series of events planned for the evening, and then explained this was the first Shabbat service to be held here in 80 years. Camille and I looked at each other and passed the tissues, and the enormity of that crashed down on us. A Rothschild had built this beautiful, unassuming synagogue. A Rothschild had sold it, thereby preserving it. A Rothschild was the last Jew in the village, and one of the last Jews to worship in the synagogue. And now, 80 years later, the Rothschilds were back to worship there again. And here we all are after the service. Karl-Heinz is on the left, and the rabbi is on the right, and then the rest of us are scattered about. After a service, we had a break for Kaffee and Kuchen, coffee and cake. They were constantly feeding us, and then moved on to the presentations. All the local dignitaries spoke, and at my request, I was able to speak a bit. I had put together a notebook about 3 inches thick of biographies of the first 3 generations of the Rothschild family in full, which I presented to Karl-Heinz and the Foote. I had a letter which I'd written and had translated into German, which I read to them, explaining how very important their work had how very important, how their very important work had influenced my research and had led me to find my roots and was directly responsible for my being there. And after careful and thoughtful discussions with my brothers and my stepdad, I presented them with a painting done by my mother in 1999, the same year the Foot of Christ was founded. I knew she would have wanted to be there if she could, and I loved the idea of leaving something of her in the synagogue. All too quickly, that trip came to an end. I was gone from home only 8 days. It was a life-changing event. I made new friends. I had found my hometown. I had connected with my ancestors in a very tangible way. I had walked where they walked, been where they lived, worshipped where they worshipped, and visited their graves. I felt energized and complete in a way I had never felt before. Ironically, or serendipitously, Camille and I had already planned a family reunion for July of that year. The 8 weeks between getting home from Germany and going to California flew by, and it seemed like every day brought a new discovery. In fact, 4 days before the reunion, we discovered another reason Adolf had chosen that little church in Burgmünden to get baptized. The pastor, Wilhelm Eberwein, was his brother-in-law. I know. At that point, Camille cut me off. She forbade me from doing any more research until after the reunion. She had written a pageant where everyone had bit parts and she and I narrated. Every time I found some new tidbit of information, she had to do a rewrite, and we were out of time. A lot of it was tongue-in-cheek, and the dialogue was 100% made up, but we had provided as many accurate details as possible. The script, if followed as written, was about 15 minutes long. Everyone ad-libbed and hammed it up to the point that it took about 45 minutes. It was hilarious and educational all at the same time. This reunion was unique in one other respect. Instead of being for the descendants of E.O. Roth, it was for the descendants of Asher Rothschild, and there were so many new faces that for the first time we needed name tags. My cousin Betty, Mom's cousin Betty, had a friend who volunteered to print them, and they hung on lanyards around our necks. Each said, "Ich bin ein Vöhler Jude," I am a Fuller Jew, and had our names. We spent 3 glorious days on the beach, hanging out with old cousins, getting to know new cousins, sharing meals, forming connections. And following the pageant, I talked about our trip to Foote. Because Adolf and his family left Germany in 1866, I had long believed my family escaped the Holocaust completely. One of the things I did between Foote and Newport was to research any relatives who may have been murdered in the Holocaust. Eventually, I found 33. But at the time of the reunion, I only had a handful. I created a memorial wall with their names and brief biographies and put them up on the wall, and I didn't say anything about them. But after I talked about our trip to Foote, someone asked me, and I was able to tell them about the people, focusing on how they lived, not how they died. To me, that seems the best way to honor their memories. Before I left Foote, Karl Heinz had given me a mezuzah from Israel. It is now proudly mounted to my doorpost, and the scroll inside contains the names of my murdered relatives, so that they are never forgotten, at least not by me. As for our reunion, I love looking at this picture and seeing those Rothschild genes in so many faces. At the suggestion of a friend, I started a blog about my ancestors and my research called Rothschilds of Foote. Then I decided to get a degree in family history research through BYU, Idaho. I took classes for 2 years, and all of my spare time was spent doing homework. I learned so much, but my time spent on research became non-existent. In fact, I deliberately am taking a year or 2 off so I can get back on track. And no matter what was happening at home, I stayed in touch with Karl Heinz and my other friends in Foote. I updated them on my life and on my research, what little there was, and they updated me on theirs, as well as everything going on with the Foot of Christ. And on 9 July 2000, 21, the Foote voted to make Camille and me honorary members because of our extraordinary services to the organization. This was one of the proudest moments of my life. I wish I could have been there to accept the award in person, but was tickled pink when the official certificate arrived in the mail and rushed off to get it framed that day. In March of 23, I received an email from Karl Heinz enthusiastically telling me the dates for the Foote 25th anniversary celebration in July of 24, and I let him know I had it on my calendar and was looking forward to seeing him again. And I figured that was plenty of time to save up the money for a trip. When I'm not doing research or playing with grandchildren, I'm quilting. In November of 2022, my friend Donna married the love of her life. I had already started making a quilt for her when I found out she was engaged, and I modified the pattern to include something to represent her husband. The round shapes are for her, the diamond shapes are for her husband. Somehow, I was able to get the quilt finished in time. I gave it to them, along with a letter expressing my gratitude to Donna for her lifetime of friendship and to George for making her so happy. Shortly after their wedding, George was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and passed away in February of 2023. The day after hearing from Karl Heinz, I got a call from Donna. She wanted me to know that she was doing fine. We talked about a lot of things, and she asked when I was going to Germany again. I laughed, told her I'd just heard from Karl Heinz and would be going in 2024. She went back to talking about her husband, that he had left her very well off, and before he passed, he had talked to her about bequests he wanted to make. He had been quite touched by the quilt and the letter that I had given them, and he wanted to pay for my trip. I wanted to decline. I really did. On pride, because I'm capable of paying for my own trip. But all I could think was the ancestors must really want me to go. We were both crying. In early July of this year, I flew to New York City and spent a few days there with Camille before we hopped a flight for Frankfurt, where we rented a car and headed north. In 2019, we had stopped briefly at the Katharinenkirche in Burggemünden to see where Adolf was baptized. It's a tiny little thing on top of a hill. We hadn't been able to see inside, and we were hoping to this time. I had been corresponding with the Stadtarchiv office in Burggemünden, specifically with Frau Kube, who had emailed us that morning, assuring us she lived right next to the church and would be happy to let us in. We got there, but the street she said she lived on was nowhere to be found. After about 30 minutes of driving around, we were out of time, so we got back on the road. The 20th anniversary celebration in 2019 had hosted 4 visitors, Daniel and Jeffrey Baird, Camille, and me. This time, though, there were 15 visitors. In addition to Camille and me, we had Ruben and Ingrid Herzberg from Hamburg, Michael and Dalia Dimar from Tel Aviv, and 9 members of the Baird family. Carol Baird and her husband had been coming to Foote all their adult lives. Rickchen Katzenstein, my cousin Selma Rothschild, and Carol's grandmother Johanna Frankenthal were the last Jews to be deported from the village. Johanna and Selma lived next door to each other. Carol came this time with her husband, sons Jeffrey and Daniel, 1 daughter-in-law, and her 4 grandchildren. 3 generations, just remarkable. This photograph was taken after the welcome dinner on Thursday evening. All 15 visitors, along with members of the Foote and visiting dignitaries. At that reception dinner, I was greeted by all of my friends with hugs and kisses, almost like a prodigal returning home. At one point during the evening, Karl Heinz said to me, "When you speak on Friday at the opening ceremonies, it would be best if it were in German." I was slated to speak on Saturday and prepared for that, but hadn't heard about Friday, so I questioned him on it. He assured me I would be speaking. Later, when talking to Carol, she seemed surprised, thinking she was the only person speaking Friday evening. We were both wrong. Friday morning dawned dark and gloomy and pouring rain like crazy. We all met at the synagogue and discussed our options. The plan had been to walk to the cemetery, but with the rain, It had just been announced that the visit to the cemetery would be rescheduled when the rain suddenly stopped. The walk was on. My brother Thomas and his daughter Jamie were supposed to meet me in Foote on Saturday, spending one glorious day with me there, but they had to cancel at the last minute. They had been in Provo on the 4th of July, so we devised a plan. I explained the custom of leaving rocks on headstones and told my brother and niece to pick stones from their garden. They brought their offerings to me when they were in Provo, and I had them write their initials on them, and I carried them with me to Foote. It was so moving and so right to place them on Sprinz's headstone. I had taken a heart-shaped polished stone that my father-in-law had given me. Thomas gave me a round stone from his garden, and my niece, a California girl to the core, gave me a seashell. Perfect. There was a new addition to the cemetery since I'd been there last, a memorial plaque listing all the names of the Jews who had been buried there. So many more than just the 46 headstones that had returned. The artist responsible for its creation, Christian Schnutz, was there to talk to us about it. The cutout shapes represent existing headstones in the cemetery. They are cut out and the ground beneath them is bare to represent the missing headstones. And the names, some are dark and some are light. The lighter ones have headstones. I marveled at all the names on the memorial, felt tears on my cheek, knowing my family will never be forgotten. I had one more stone in my pocket, a piece of lapis lazuli that my friend Donna assures me will bring balance and peace to my soul. It seemed only fitting to leave it on the memorial to honor all my relatives. While waiting for the rain to let up before going to the cemetery, we all milled about the synagogue. Camille spent some time in quiet contemplation in Platz Nummer 1. For my part, I went exploring, and I found an area set up as a museum. So many beautiful artifacts have been found. Last year, someone bought a box of random items at an auction, and in the box was an autographed book that had been owned by Selma Rothschild. This person later donated this to the Förderkreis. Selma's father, Moritz Moses Rothschild, Adolf's brother, had owned the Prince Wilhelm Hotel, and Selma had collected autographs and writings from the guests. The book was in terrible shape, so the Förderkreis asked for donations to restore it, and I'm thrilled to report that my cousins and I raised the bulk of the money for it. Also in the museum was Mom's painting, all framed, and I'm assured it will soon have a plaque explaining its importance. Friday night's opening ceremonies started with Sarah Kupfer lighting candles, giving a Sabbath prayer, and sharing chalot with everyone. I think every political dignitary for 100 miles in every direction was there, and in addition to Carol Baird and me, they all spoke, mostly in German. This went on for about 3 hours. My German is so much better than it used to be, but most of it went over my head. Camille had a translation app on her phone that would take spoken conversation and convert it to English. The accuracy of this is based on the speed and clarity of the speaker. Needless to say, the translation was, for the most part, hilariously wrong, and I'm afraid we just giggled through most of the evening. There was so much going on in these few days in Foote, all of them important for different reasons. But the main event, at least for me, took place on Saturday morning with the unveiling of 3 historical markers and a new street sign. We started with the street sign. There is a tiny alley between the synagogue and the neighboring house. It was named after Solomon Baer, who had been the Jewish school teacher for an amazing 40 years, from 1841 until his death in 1881. Next, we went to the Frankenthal house. Carol, normally so calm, became quite emotional as she spoke of her family and unveiled the beautiful marker, and then called her family to join her. We moved next door to the massive Rothschild house. This is the reason I had come to Foote, to honor my family in a permanent and lasting way. I shared what I knew about my family, about Asher Rothschild, his wives and children, his influence on the community, both Jew and Gentile. Then Reuben Herzberg spoke. It was his great-grandfather who had been the Jewish school teacher, Solomon Baer, who had lived and taught at the Rothschild house for 40 years. What a proud, emotional moment for both of us when we gently pulled the sheet from the marker. After I hugged Reuben, After, I hugged Reuben and told him this is no longer just the Rothschild house, this is the Bear house as well. Camille and I were able to visit later with Christian Schnatz, the artist. He pointed out to us there are 3 sections to the marker, and that the second and third sections need to be reversed places. He assured us he will take care of that. He also explained the significance of the stars. They represent the stars on the ceiling of the synagogue, and that addition was suggested by one of the high school students who had volunteered at the synagogue the previous summer. Lastly, we went to the marker for the Mildenberg family. The house is no longer there, but a marker was placed on the street near where it had been. Michael Demore shared pictures of his ancestors as he spoke. To say this was an emotional morning would be an understatement. All of us were overcome with feelings of joy. Sunday began with a worship service in the Lutheran Church. My family has ties to this church. In 1847, Asher Rothschild financed its construction. There are records to indicate that a young pastor in training, Wilhelm Eberwein, spent some time here, and that's probably where he met his future wife, Friederike Rothschild. For this special day, Pastor Günther Meyer came out of retirement and, with Pastor Matthias Müller, offered the most amazing sermon. He spoke of Christ, but pointed out Christ was a Jew, and expressed the feeling that because of this, all followers of Christ are Jews at heart. He points out that we are all children of God, should all strive to see and greet and treat each other as equals. Lutherans sing a lot in their services, and the first hymn was one of my mother's favorite. I felt like she was there with us. A number of the hymns were actually in Hebrew. In fact, one of them, we opened up our book to the page number, and Carol Baird's granddaughter behind me said, "Oh my God, I know this one." I have attended worship services for many different denominations, but I have never attended one that felt so completely all-inclusive. Everyone was commenting on that afterwards. It was such a beautiful experience. After church was lunch, and it was there we began saying goodbye to people. The Demores were leaving to go home to Tel Aviv, and Jeffrey Baird and his wife and children were also leaving. The time had gone far too quickly. Following lunch, those of us who hadn't left traveled to Volkmarsen, about 30 miles away, to visit the museum there. About 10 years ago, Ernst Klein, Karl Heinz's counterpart, approached a homeowner who was known to have an unusual basement with a medieval stone pedestal holding up the ceiling. His research had led him to believe this had been a Jewish home for centuries, and he was convinced there was a mikveh in the basement. He talked the homeowner into letting him excavate the basement. If he found a mikveh, great. If not, he'd put everything back the way he found it. He found the mikveh. It's 500 years old, and the natural spring that fed it was still feeding it. When the homeowner passed shortly after, he purchased the house and turned it into a museum to educate everyone about the effects of Nazi perversion. When we were there in 2019, the museum was 2 weeks away from opening. Since that time, the board of the museum voted for a new president, and Ernst was forced to step down and step away. On this visit, we met him at a nearby cemetery for a quick visit before going to the museum. The mikveh is still open for viewing, but there have been some changes. In 2019, we could go down the steps, but the steps have now been cordoned off, and a glass sky bridge has been erected over it, so visitors can still see down into it without risk of injury. More goodbyes, this time to the rest of the Bairds. We would likely see them at dinner that evening, but just in case. On Monday morning, Camille and I got up at the crack of dawn, and I drove her to the train station in Marburg. She was on to the next part of her adventure, exploring cave paintings in Spain. I was invited to go with her. I contemplated going to Paris. I even thought about visiting a friend in Poland. In the end, though, I decided to spend a few days in Foote, and Karl Heinz and his sweet wife Birgit invited me to stay with them. I was supposed to be there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and most of Thursday. The plans included a tour of the interior of the Rothschild house. Pastor Meyer had found a bunch of loose documents which he'd given to the Futterkreis, and which Karl Heinz and I were going to go through. Photography outing with Uli, who is an amazing photographer. Other plans included more time in the synagogue and another visit to the cemetery. Wednesday night, I was going to take my friends to dinner, and somewhere in there, I had to find presents for my family. Monday went according to plan, with Birgit and I visiting the nearby Castle Waldeck. Built in the 1500s, it has since been turned into a high-end hotel and restaurant with a walk-through museum of the dungeon section of the castle. Tuesday morning, Uli and I grabbed our cameras, and he took me to the nearby Nationalpark Kellerwald Edersee, where we walked through the forest and took beautiful photos. Karl-Heinz and Birgit then took me to Korbach in the afternoon for sightseeing and present buying. Wednesday morning, I woke up with what I thought was allergies, but soon became apparent I was quite sick. I spent a good part of the day in my room and finally explained to my friends that I had to leave. I could not run the risk of getting them sick. If I was feeling enough better in the morning, I'd come back. I did not. I didn't say goodbye to my friends. I told them I would be back, and I will, probably in 2029 for the 30th anniversary celebration, which coincides with the 200th anniversary of the dedication of the synagogue. On Tuesday, before I got sick, Karl-Heinz had helped me call Frau Kuba of Burggemünden, and I explained what had happened the previous Thursday. She confirmed her address, confirmed she lived on the same street as the Katharinenkirche, and that she would be glad to meet me there on Thursday afternoon. And so, on Thursday, I made my way back to the district of Gemünden, following the instructions on my nav. I was led to a church called Katharinenkirche, but it was in Niedergemünden, not Burggemünden. I went to the address, which was indeed right next door. There was a man walking around the garden, and he met me at the gate. When I asked for Frau Kuba, I was told she was at the office and wouldn't be back until evening. Feeling defeated and resigned, I began to walk away. Then he called after me, "Sind Sie die Amerikanerin? Are you the American?" When I agreed that I was, he introduced himself as Tom, told me Frau Kuba had asked him to wait for me and give me a tour of the church. He invited me into the garden, had me sit at the patio table, offered me some water. He was settling in to answer all my questions when I explained there had been some sort of a mistake. I was wanting to see the Katharinenkirche in Burggemünden, not Niedergemünden. He pulled out his phone, made a quick phone call, then said, "Okay, you can drive, yes? We take your car." On the way, Tom explained the patron saint of the district of Gemünden is Catherine. So all churches in the district are named in her honor, Katharinenkirche. 10 minutes down the road, I stopped while he ran into a house and back out with a key. Moments later, we were there at the church and he was opening the door. That would have been enough for me, honestly, just to walk through this tiny church. But Tom turned out to be a wellspring of information. The church began as a chapel attached to a castle in 1270. Over the centuries, the chapel expanded into a church and the castle disappeared. The artwork on the walls has a distinctive Moorish influence, and I realized it would have been painted during the Crusades. Most churches of this era have a stone basin of some kind for baptisms, but the font in Burggemünden is different. An angel carved from wood and beautifully painted, seeming to hover above the ground, holding a brass basin. Here is where my family history took an unexpected turn. Here is where a nice Jewish boy named Abraham was baptized and changed his name to Adolf so that he could marry the woman he loved. I hadn't done everything I had hoped to do on this trip, but I had done the important things. And while part of me wished I had a few more days, my soul was at peace and I was ready to go home. I don't know if anyone's still there. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
We're still
Oh,
here.
thank you, Joshua.
We're still here. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank
Good.
you.
It was beautiful. Thank you.
It's been a wild ride.
It's amazing. I just one miracle after another. That is
It has
fabulous.
been.
Just amazing.
There-
Obviously, something that needed to be done.
Apparently.
Wow. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, I am so glad we did. We need to get out of here in 20 minutes.
Okay.
So I want to thank everyone. Are there people there? Are there more questions? I can't hear.
There's only been the one comment. Are there any other questions?
Not questions, just it was.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you. See y'all later.
Okay, thank you. Next month business meeting, I'll post it.